But it's not just the book, it's about how do we understand architecture, ways to operate in this contemporary multimedia culture. The Smithsons offer us a lesson, and the lesson that they offer us is this figure of the Mies-Image, which is really their preoccupation. I think that's, if there's an original idea in the book, it's this idea that the way to understand the Smithsons' career is a 50-year pursuit of not just emulating Mies, but the image of what Miesian architecture, Miesian space, Miesian imaginary is. And that this video, which is, again, Allison giving a gallery talk about an exhibition or a particular building, which they then tie back, like everything they do, to their first project and other projects that came after. They were constantly historicizing themselves, and every time they're historicizing themselves and historicizing this notion of new brutalism, they're essentially rethinking this idea of the Mies-Image. So then the other thing that happens in the book is, except in a couple of cases, the images happen through these arrays. And every one of these arrays is an attempt to not just talk about a single image, but to understand that every image begets another image, circulates through other images, creates a kind of constellation and an imaginary. And many of these images reappear at various points in the book. There's 39 of these in the book. But again, in trying to think about how do you work with imagery in this kind of post-photographic, multimedia networked, automated imaging culture that we have today. And, one of those, a key feature, and I try to do this with my students, is always think about imagery in these kind of really dynamic, interactive amongst themselves, circulating sort of arrays. So the book, as I just said, is itself a kind of Mies-Image. And it elaborates in both text and images the theory and history of this thing called the Mies-Image. It exemplifies its subject as well as talks about it, illustrates it, and so on. Of course, it's also about new brutalism, the Smithsons, Banham, and many other things. But the Mies-Image is the figure through which all of that circulates and in which it coheres. Slide. What do I do? I'm pressing the buttons. Press the keypad. Thanks. So before I go into this whole talk about the theories and materials in this, quote, new book, as you'll see, the word new, that's one of the things I'll talk about, is a tricky word, especially today. But being here today isn't a random event. Mehrdad explained that, where someone shows up who you've never heard of at the Stuckman School. So acknowledgements are necessary. The gestures of thanks, appreciation for the generosity of a school, people, and debts owed to people. But acknowledgements also explain how things come to be. So, as Mehrdad said, this book didn't just happen on its own. A lot of it happened because Mehrdad asked me to write this piece about his building. All right. Not doing this today. Cross our fingers. So as he said, about a decade ago, Mehrdad asked me to write this essay for this book about his Lafayette 148 building in China. He had a hunch because he knew me but also because I think he heard about a lecture I had given in Montreal that had something to do with the things he's was thinking about in this building. And his hunch and his invitation to contribute to his book gave no contribution to my book. So I want to thank Mehrdad for that. So that essay, like this book, was an object lesson in the intersection of architecture history. You'd think it would be something. You might have to just stand here. An object lesson in the intersection of architecture's history and architecture in the present. For me, in my essay in this book, Lafayette 148 exemplifies a new phase in the largely misunderstood legacy of New Brutalism. His building was a newer New Brutalism. Lafayette 148 helped me understand and theorize how the kinds of cognition and intelligence that dominate our architectural imaginations today have curious historical sources, even if the way we imagine and experience and produce architecture now is very different than it was 60 or 70 years ago at the time of New Brutalism. History and theory both help us understand the present, which in fact is the way Allison and Peter Smithson take their work. They treated each new project as a chance to rethink their own New Brutalist beginnings. My book uses imaging theory to explain not only that New Brutalism is a source for today's computational, automated, mediated realities of production and exchange, and I'll talk more on that later. Twisted is the title of Mehrdad's book, and describes his building. Twisted Image is the title of my essay in it. It begins by playing around with a phrase, you see there, surprising twists, in Rayner Banham's 1955 essay on the New Brutalism. So in thinking about Banham's twists, I was thinking not only of a way to make a connection across 60 years of history between New Brutalism in England and a twisted building in China. Banham's essay has become the center of my book, or at least one of several centers in that book, that the book unravels and reassembles. Historically, Banham's essay is the lost center of New Brutalism. On the one hand, everyone who writes about New Brutalism references and discusses this essay as an exemplary intellectual event in the history of New Brutalism. On the other hand, virtually nobody fully examines or explains what Banham was really up to. It's lost in that way, but it's also lost in history. The essay, or at least the most important aspects of it, went missing in the discussions of New Brutalism after this essay's publication. The Smithsons also never really discussed the essay. And 10 years later, Banham would explicitly reject his own audacious, speculative, prescient ideas about how architecture might adapt to the emerging imaging culture after World War II. Writing about the essay 10 years later in 1966, he called it an attempt to father some of my own pet notions that were not truly representative of the state of the brutalist movement at that time in its evolution. And you notice he calls it the brutalist movement. He doesn't call it the New Brutalist movement, which is part of our problem that I'll talk about in a minute. The history of the essay is thus twisted. The surprising twists that Banham was referring to in the essay are his central ideas. Proposes two phases of New Brutalism. In the second one, New Brutalism introduced these concepts of topology and image as he calls them more generalized concepts than geometry and beauty. So image, topology replace geometry and beauty. And that's those are these pet notions that he ultimately rejects. But of course, I think they're crucial insights that the Smithsons hung on to, whether they addressed it specifically or not. Topology is, of course, twisted. It's the mathematics of surfaces and shapes. My book attempts to show how Banham's so-called pet notions were not only auspicious speculations, they were latent in the Smithsons' way of working for their entire career. Topology was most clearly explored by the Smithsons in their idea of this thing called the street deck, these surfaces that ran through buildings like streets. But my understanding of New Brutalism focuses on the concept of image or imaging practices, specifically this concept or figure of the Mies-Image. So the thesis of the book is that the Smithsons' diverse and seemingly idiosyncratic work is actually coherent if we think of it as a 50-year pursuit of the Mies-Image. This way of understanding the Smithsons emphasizes their beginnings as simultaneously and seemingly paradoxically admirers of the Chicago Mies and participants in the proto-pop experiments of the independent group in London. Thus, my story diverges from the conventional wisdom shared by many admirers of the Smithsons, as well as many fans of brutalism. The book's about new brutalism, not brutalism. And I'll, as I promised, I'll get to that word new in a bit. The confusion or conflation of new brutalism and brutalism is not unusual. It's even latent in Banham's two versions of new brutalism, as I pointed out. Sometimes he, the Smithsons, others don't use the word new. In the first version, he equates New Brutalist project, the earliest New Brutalist projects of the Smithsons, the Soho House and the Hunstanton School down in I guess I have a little pointer. These two projects here. And the second one was characterized by the importance of topology and image, particularly in something like the Sheffield University competition project right there. The first version was over by 1955, and it had been superseded by the second one sometime around 1953, but still was not fulfilled. So therefore, when Banham says, these were my pet notions and they weren't really characteristic of New Brutalism at that important moment in its evolution, he's right, because one part was over and the other part hadn't quite emerged yet. So Banham's first tamer version, and here's the principles of that first version. First tamer version was indeed representative of the movement, but not quite at that time. The second version offers astute speculations that were representative of its potential at that time. The first situates New Brutalism in the context of the debates among British architects about their relationship to the legacy of what Banham called the classical modernist movement. Despite the differences between the austere steel, glass, and brick Miesian idiom of Hunstanton and the raw concrete and masonry warehouse aesthetic of the Soho House, the criteria that define those two projects and the first phase of New Brutalism, formal legibility of plan, clear exhibition of structure, valuation of materials to their inherent qualities as found, which are in fact the criteria that many people admire the Smithsons for, which is fine, but I don't think it really gets at what their real contribution is that we should be paying attention to now. Those characteristics are a kind of earnestly modern caricature of New Brutalism that would be taken up by others and would persist in this thing called brutalism in the late 50s into the 60s and beyond. So in attempting to explain the potential of the second approach, Banham charted a path that the Smithsons were only beginning to explore, in which he articulated though not entirely consistently or clearly or definitively or explicitly, as the theory of a newer New Brutalist. So while most readers of his essay who probably don't spend a great deal of time trying to figure out all its complexities, which are exacerbated by Banham's sometimes twisted writing, they mistakenly think that his theory of New Brutalism is crystallized in these three criteria. Uh, two of which he offers at the end of his essay. It's not cooperating again. So Banham's second, more compelling and astute theory, the one about topology and imaging, can be pieced together from three evocative phrases that appear in various places in the essay that are here. Memorability as image, obsessive emphasis on basic structure, and abstemious underdesigning of the details, and in eloquence. But the strands of his theory actually are tied up into an outlandish and deceptively subversive bow at the very end of the essay in a mischievous but brilliant footnote, where he lays bare the significance of topology and image, as well as his advocacy for an attitude that could be called vulgar sophistication. Banham's footnote is at once the most sophisticated statement of aesthetic theory in the essay and a digressive reference to a vulgar source. I should keep back there. The footnote playfully exemplifies what could be termed vulgar sophistication in two different ways. On the one hand, the idea of an aesthetics based on aformal anti-geometric imaging practices is an anti-academic, sophisticated philosophical and mathematical ideas. On the other hand, he finds evidence of aesthetic sophistication in a vulgar source, this science fiction, and particularly this cover of a science fiction magazine, which he says you can learn about topology in this image, shape and surface, interiority, exteriority, by looking at this image, and you don't need to know the mathematics. So it's kind of condescending, but it's this play of vulgarity and sophistication together. So with that all set up, I want to jump cut to another lost event, which is that video, another surprising twist that epitomizes both vulgar sophistication and the Mies-Image. It's this video, first captured on tape, but now digitized, available on the Architectural Association's YouTube channel. It's the inspiration for the book's cover, as I mentioned earlier. And for me, it's an extraordinarily rich and even canonical document of New Brutalism. On Halloween in 1975, a gallery talk by Alison Smithson was inexpertly documented on videotape, and using, then a fairly crude version of, the consumer type of video camera. So, it's all kind of messed up, vulgarized, you might say. For the entire 15-minute runtime, as a residual artifact of the technology, Alison, the gallery, and its contents bathed in a saturated orange-pink glow. The camera's focus wavers as its operator intermittently and awkwardly zooms in and zooms out, moving from views through and of the suspended and wall-mounted clear plastic panels in the white room to close-ups of a book and of several photographs that Alison holds in her hands. the shots of her speaking while walking among the large drawings sandwiched between the plastic sheets. The peculiar qualities of that crude yet captivating video were unintended byproducts of the technology. But as it turns out, its oddball sensibility, its technical imperfections, and the recording of Allison's carefully chosen words were a fortuitous extension and mediation of the exhibition's ambition. In other words, the video does the exhibition better than the exhibition itself. It out new brutalizes, new brutalism. I believe the video may well be the exemplary instantiation of new brutalism as I understand it, and as I believe the Smithsons came to understand it. The recording was made 2 decades after Banham's New Brutalism essay appeared in Architectural Review, yet the video effectively demonstrates the continuing viability of Banham's pet notions, his theorization of New Brutalism as an architecture of, quote, image making, and it exemplifies the Smithsons' lifelong pursuit of the Mies-Image. So just to kind of synopsize the story here, we have this video, 1975, Banham and many people think of the kind of, he calls it the locus solus of New Brutalism, that's occurring in this exhibition called Parallel of Life and Art that the Smithsons did with a sculptor and a photographer. It was these enlarged kind of documentary images that they each had taken from their books and magazines and other things they had collected. So this locus solus of New Brutalism as imaging and topology, is often located in the Parallel of Life and Art show at the Institute of Contemporary Art, in part because that's where the independent group was meeting. This is very much an independent group project, mass media as environment kind of project. At its simplest, we can look at a kind of array like this and see this way that the Mies-Image, whether it's on Stanton School on the left, which is obviously Miesian, Parallel of Life and Art, which isn't so obviously Miesian, but maybe that space isn't that different than the way the Smithsons came to understand the space of the Stanton School, or in a later project like Patio and Pavilion on the right, which has a kind of Miesian quality with this mirrored enclosure and a little pavilion in the middle, and then all this kind of detritus installed in it that Henderson and Pelosi did after Allison and Peter designed the skirts or designed the physical enclosure. Another way, just to add a couple more images to these days, sort of do an object lesson of how these arrays work. Some of the first images that the Smithsons saw of these were in this 1946 article in Architects Journal in London. And there's this one incredible image of the Minerals and Metals building, which is also in Phil Johnson's catalog of the Mies Show from 1947, which is also a book that they had. So, whether we're looking at this, again, not picture, but a kind of imaging of architecture with all its qualities and characteristics, or we look at the image above it of the Stanton School, or we look at any of these others, together we start to get a sense of what this kind of paradigm of imaging is that allowed them to understand. And at some level, it can be just this simple. Right? There's that 1946 photo. There's a still from the video. And if you, are starting to channel and understand their imaginary through this concept of the Mies-Image, we can start to see how these two one a video tape, a still from a videotape, the other composed artistic photo documenting a work of architecture. How we can start to think of what this Mies-Image is and how it works. And then, of course, in the book, take that, not just 2 images, but however many. I think overall in the book, there's about 300 images. Many of them appear multiple times, 39 arrays, 300 images, 400 individual images, that all together, these arrays give us the information and the experience, the data we need to process to understand what the Mies-Image would be. And of course, reading the book doesn't hurt either. So I want to just talk about these 2 words, imaging and new. I promise new, and imaging obviously is important. Imaging complicates and supersedes our theoretical and historical understanding of modernist visuality and established concepts of representation and abstraction. Imaging practices, from printing and fabricating to screening and scanning to modeling and animating, whether they're ubiquitous and banal or esoteric and rarefied, are post-photographic transdisciplinary modes of production, exchange, and experience that operate through the iteration and affiliation, the proliferation and efficacy of visual materials that are processed electronically, digitally, but also neurologically. Imaging taps our evolved cognitive capacities for pattern recognition, serial processing, and spatial imagination in old and new ways. The second word, new, creates confusion in both contemporary and historical discussions of new brutalism. It's strange and important to remember that brutalism came after new brutalism. And the missing word new, which also appears in my book's title, That's Brutal, repeats the symptom. From the beginning, the Smithsons and others around them, architects, editors, artists, were inconsistent in their use of the word new. That was in part just a colloquial shorthand, but it contributed to the later confusion of new brutalism with brutalism. Popular knowledge and discussion of post-war architecture. It reminds us that new brutalism was never intended to be simply new or simply modern. The peculiar question of how new brutalism came to be mistakenly associated with the monumental concrete brutalist architecture of the British welfare state is a curious slippage of language, sequence, and memory. And what I try to do in the book is to recuperate the particular newness of new brutalism, or particular and peculiar newness of new brutalism. So in the name of new brutalism, and in pursuit of what I'm calling the Mies-Image, Allison and Peter Smithson initiated a manner and a mode of late modernism that remains provocative, puzzling, and pertinent. Their pursuit began in 1950 with the design of the Hunstanton School as an effort to see something new, Mies, in his Chicago work. It continued when they began to see something new in Stanton as it was being built. And then for several decades afterwards, in their incessant, persistent reimaging of their own work and of Mies. New brutalism first coalesced as a scene, I'll talk a bit about that word later, in the last months of 1953, when Stanton reached what the Smithsons would later call the wall of reflection at the glaze stage. The glass went into the structure. And it lit some kind of imaginary for them, where they started to see the building that was totally unexpected for them, or largely unexpected, maybe we should say. So that moment of 1953, the layering the layering of reflection at the glaze stage on Stanton. It's also within a month or two, the same time that the phrase New Brutalism first appeared in print. And it's also within a month or two when Parallel of Life and Art, the exhibition that I just talked about with Henderson and Pelosi, was staged in London at the ICA. 5 years later, in the late 1950s, their pursuit of the Mies-Image gathered new momentum when Peter traveled twice to America and saw many of Mies's buildings, as well as some of the Eames's house. It intensified a decade after that in 1967 when they presented a seminar on Mies in Berlin. And their pursuit culminated in the imaging practices of their subsequent books, especially in the 70s and 80s, and their lectures and their exhibitions, as well as architectural design work, which in varied ways reconfigured the latent potential of the 1953 scene that launched their careers. I use this term scene in a sense that I get from the philosopher Jacques Rancière, and that he theorizes in his book Aesthesis in 2011, so not long ago. And he calls this book a counter-history of aesthetic modernity, in which the writing of each chapter articulates what he calls the sensible fabric and intelligible form of a historically and discursively entangled moment. From Winckelmann's musings about the Belvedere torso up there on the left in 1764, to James Agee's account of the lives of Alabama sharecroppers in his 1941 book, Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. Rancière says, the scene is not the illustration of an idea. It's a little optical machine that shows us thought, busy weaving together perceptions, affects, names, ideas, constituting the sensible community that makes such weaving thinkable. Rancière describes this so-called method of the scene as fundamentally anti-hierarchical. It's the object that teaches us how we can treat it. The scene abolishes the difference between the object and its explanation. The Smithsons' way of making sense of their scene in 1953 was contrarian and capacious. They looked to history, especially what they called the heroic period of modern architecture, from just before and just after the First World War, but also looked at classical architecture from the Greeks to the Japanese to Gunnar Asplund. They looked at contemporary magazines, films, art, industrial design, advertising. They looked at furniture and throwaway objects that would be worth collecting. They looked in the explanations of anthropology and sociology. They looked above all in the work of their professional heroes, Charles and Ray Eames, who gave us courage. This is Allison writing, gave us courage to make sense of anything that attracted. But especially they looked at the beginning with from Stanton and increasingly for the rest of their lives. And just to point out in this array, these images are the images that were in that exhibition that the video was made of for a project called the Lucas Headquarters that they never built. You know, so being able to see that project in 1975, or around 1975, as a Mies-Image is one of these recurrences of their new brutalist beginning. Here's a quote from their book, Without Rhetoric, from 1973, which is itself a collection of essays they had already published. They recurated it, re-illustrated it, and constructed it as this, quote, building in miniature. Simply on the basis that successive generations can find something fresh and particular to themselves in any work of art, we should be able to find Mies's building something useful in our immediate course, although not necessarily what Mies himself intended. We should not look at his buildings for what can be lifted off to paper over the next client's program, or to lose our aesthetic problem. They are to be seen as a vehicle conveying the self-construction, the self-control, and the reticence now needed by an architect. So the Smithsons hung on to insights like these as images, open to constant revision, recursion, recollection, and recognition. What they achieved was the invention of a Mies-Image, quite unlike what they saw when they first looked at the published photographs and drawings that inspired the design of the Mies-Image school. That's Brutal What's Modern attempts to recuperate both Banham's rejected theorization of and the Smithson's recursive practice of imaging. It builds on Banham's theory that New Brutalism requires, quote, that the building should be an immediately apprehensible visual entity, and the form grasped by the eye should be confirmed by the experience in use. And it should fully validate the presence of the human being as part of the total image. And of course, as I said, Banham, within a couple of years, he was already abandoning what he called his pet notions. So it was picked up by others like Volcker, who I think gives us maybe the most eloquent expression of what this kind of architecture as imaging practice might be. It's especially in the case of New Brutalism. And of course, he calls it brutalism. He doesn't call it New Brutalism. He calls it brutalism. Brutalism aims to invent those unique images from bits and pieces, stone, door handle, standard metal window, polythene pipe, etc., which communicate and are inevitable in the historical, ecological, technological situation as found. The historian Robert Middleton in 1966 gives us another evocative version of these ideas. This is what he wrote in a review of Banham's book on New Brutalism, where he's kind of taking apart Banham and saying he doesn't really understand the Smiths. Mies van der Rohe's beautifully articulated buildings for the Illinois Institute of Technology suggested a point of departure. The buildings were reticent, clean, and easily apprehended. They provided a ready-made aesthetic. But the Smithsons' real discovery was more personal in inspiration. They realized more personal in inspiration. They realized that they would have to build up their architecture from whatever fragments were available. But the problem remained how to relate one to another, and then the building as a whole, so that the result might be architecture. Charles and Ray Eames provided the Smithsons with a objects could be arranged, apparently casually, against the neutral background to forceful resultant effect. The combination of the Mies aesthetic with the Eames concept of arrangement proved electrifying when interpreted by the Smithsons. The wash hand basins and kitchen stoves at Hunstanton, up there on the left, seen against the walls of glass, convey still the strongest impression of the brutalist image. So images and imaging have been, as we know, have been denigrated as ephemeral or deceitful for centuries in Western culture. But Banham, Volcker, Middleton, Rancière, and the Eameses and the Smithson reports show us in different ways that imaging theories and practices propose alternative modes of thoughtful looking and seeing that could be as intelligent, intellectual, and constructive as geometry or language, or modernist models of visuality, especially now in today's world of ubiquitous digital media and the incessant distribution, replication, recording, and processing of digital images. During the long 4 years when Hunstanton was under construction, the Smithsons began to see everything differently and to see more in Hunstanton than they anticipated. The new imaginary invoked and provoked by the appearance of the constructed building was enabled by new sensibilities, interests, and awareness that they had developed through their participation in the meetings at the ICA beginning in 1952. During the interval between winning the Constantin competition in the spring of 1950 and the building's completion in 1954, Smithsons had moved from a commitment to Mies motivated primarily by modernist ideas, as Merdad said in the introduction, modernist ideas about program, form, space, structure, detailing, materials, to seeing their building as a complex architectural apparatus that was as tangible and direct in its material means as it was elusive and mutable in its virtual effects. By the summer of 1953, when the building reached the layering of reflection at the glaze stage, the Smithsons began to see the ways that architecture was implicated in and susceptible to the same kinds of observation and imagination required in a much broader and more enticing popular visual and intellectual contemporary culture, comic books, movies, television, and so on. In late 1953, multiple aspects of the Smithsons' expanding world converged, and for the remainder of their careers, they strived to understand what they had been seeking from the beginning by reiterating, revising, and augmenting their explanations of New Brutalism and their speculative scrutiny of the Mies-Image. Profound expansion of the Smithsons' sensibility in the early 1950s was the beginning of a productive and ongoing effort to position and promote architecture as central to and effective within an emerging imaging culture of advertising, film, magazines, photography, and other mass media. Constantin's design, New Brutalism's ethos, and the independent group's radicality are bound up together as the sources of insights and an acumen that the Smithsons never stopped unpacking, scrutinizing, and developing. Increasingly, in many ways and over many years, their aesthetic circulated and evolved around and through their ongoing yet fitful and acknowledged fascination and coming to terms with the potential that they saw and found in Mies. Simply put, New Brutalism can be defined as the Smithsons' pursuit of the Mies-Image. New Brutalism might thus be understood not as a movement or a theoretical position in the course of modern architecture, but as a transdisciplinary scene launched by the Smithsons with inspiration and instruction by Pelosi and Henderson and many others as an evasion of contemporary trends in British architecture and in pursuit of other varieties of modernism that operate as, in Rancière's words, the deployment of appearances as a form of writing, or as a tension of many surfaces on one surface, of many kinds of corporality within one body. Instead of intentions and causes, actions and effects, or words and principles, Rancière's aesthetic regime, his words, consecrates the triumph of the gaze over the hand, and the exemplary cinematic body turns out to be one that is constantly bombarded by events, none of which are the result of its own intentions. Pelosi's collages, patterns, and mechanically absurd, comically monstrous, and perversely erotic bodies, along with Henderson's photography of worked surfaces, brick walls to wallpapered interiors, and of the shop front signs, people, machines, and detritus of post-war London streets, provoked a new awareness in the Smithsons of this condition. So it's in this way that the Constantin, New Brutalism, and the Smithsons' later work, from Christmas cards to writings, installations, buildings, urban design, are best understood as instances of what Rancière calls the transformation of the forms of sensible experience and of the paradoxical links between the aesthetic paradigm and the political community. Understanding New Brutalism in that way propels its potential beyond architecture, beyond photography and cinema, in ways that anticipate what we have now, the electronic imaging of television and video, as well as digital media's pulsing, refreshing screens, which operate today as a new surface of design of the Mies-Image. Thank you.
You can take questions, right?
I'll try.
Okay.
I'm
All
more
right.
interested to listen to the questions than to answer them, but absolutely.
Okay. Do we have any questions from the audience?
Thank you. I'm still kind of confused. I have like two questions. My first one is I'm still kind of confused with you keep saying Miesian, this is Miesian. What is Miesian to you? What's your idea of something that is Miesian? Or what's the definition of it?
Well, there's this shift to this. What I'm really trying to do is get across how for their entire career, the Smithsons kept coming back to me with certain, times when they sort of didn't think about it, but very few. They kept coming back to me and seeing more and more and more in and so what I guess the way I would characterize it is that for them, Mies was a kind of image architecture. We think of Mies as this austere, doctrinaire, formalist, pure use of materials and all of this stuff. But, what they were seeing was somehow that his architecture was adequate to World War II mass media world, right? And that to understand him as a formalist or to understand him as somehow being about the almost nothing detail is to miss the way his building is actually his architecture, especially after World War II, but even before, is enabling a kind of aesthetic that's adequate to mass media culture. There's this little essay they have on Mies in 1967 that comes out of this seminar that I was talking about that they did in Berlin, where they say Mies is surprisingly tuned into our culture. So they're trying to show how even as sort of seemingly empty his architecture is, it's actually a little bit like, say, a camera, some sort of a device that allows us to process highly complex sort of ways of perceiving our world, through the glass, against the glass, patterns, textures, sound, all of this sort of stuff. So, I think so. What they did is, in a way, invent kind of a Mies that actually in the 80s, when the Barcelona Pavilion was reconstructed, there was this whole discourse, like when I was a student, there was this whole discourse about Mies as an architecture, right? Like, this is a moment when computation is starting, AutoCAD starting to trickle in, and other forms of digital mediation are starting to become important. Right, the first Macintosh is 1984, right, which is almost about the same time that the Barcelona Pavilion gets reconstructed, and people start, people like Stan Allen and many others, talking about Mies as an architecture of mediation. Michael Hayes talks about Mies that way. So, does that start to get at your question? So there's this other Mies that it's not the Smithsons alone, but I think they saw it long before everyone started to see this in the 1980s. Not by chance, it's when a building gets reconstructed, right? And the only thing people really knew about Barcelona Pavilion was, there's like, what, 16 photographs that were taken of it in 1929. You know, and then, of course, there's some drawings and stuff, but, you know, there's, what we knew about it was totally mediated as an image. And then it gets rebuilt as a physical thing, and we start to see that physical thing through, you know, as mediated through our own memory of the imagery of it, right? And then people start to see the building differently, it's like experience it differently. And of course, the rebuilt one isn't exactly like, you know, the original, like its tone is different. And the original photographs weren't in color. You know, so it's that kind of way that, you know, one's imaginary gets processed as a kind of dynamic flow and continuous flow of imagery. That starts to align with the way aesthetics are changing in, you know, a world of mass media and mass communication. You know, so the Smithsons were just barely on the precipice of that. You know, after World War II, you know, all of a sudden in Britain, all this American, like, comic books and American movies, the stuff is starting to flow in, right? And they're just fascinated by it. You know, which is where the independent group comes in, right? The beginnings of pop art. So again, you know, when they say in this 1967 essay that Mies is surprisingly tuned into our culture, you know, things like prawn toasters and Volkswagens and, you know, abstract art and stuff like that. You know, it's that an architecture like Mies's is available to being processed or perceived or aestheticized in ways that are in fact adequate to, you know, that emerging world of networks, created, reproduced, you know, incessant imaging.
Yeah. And then I had a second one, which was you talking about brutalism and new brutalism, and how you said a quote about how their goal was to reinvent everything, even like synths and doors. Why reinvent everything, but still have it be brutal and still call it brutal? Well, what's your take? Why do you think they did that?
Thank you. If that's that again, I didn't quite follow her.
So you talked about earlier how with a lot about brutalism and new brutalism, and you said a quote about how brutalists wanted to reinvent everything, even like sinks and doors and door handles. Why do you think why reinvent everything, but still have it be brutal and still call it brutal?
Well, I think I said they wanted to reinvent it.
You said earlier something about a quote about how the goal was to reinvent.
Yeah, I think what Volcker was saying is that they were building their architecture out of all these that are seemingly banal or ordinary or inert, you know, like pipes and door handles and glass, all of that stuff. And that, like pop art does, right? It paints a Campbell soup can or, you know, screen print of it or, you know, whatever it would be, right? You know, you take this. You want to, if there's one point of sort of, you know, let's be careful about where we understand that word. That word, it's almost random that they carved it. No one really knows where that came from. It just, there's all sorts of little stories about that. So, you know, I wouldn't fixate too much on like what your ordinary understanding of the word is. But again, it's not about reinventing everything. It's about creating something, you know, what new out of things that seem completely ordinary.
Thank you.
Mark, was there any dialogue between Mies and the Smithsons in any direct way? I know that, you know, Mies is famous for not having written anything.
Right.
I'm curious to know how his work was disseminated and how they became exposed to it. And whether or not, for example, I think if I remember correctly, the IIT campus was in the mid-40s to late 50s. Oh,
Right.
and,
Early.
and that was the date of the New Stanton School.
It was the competition entry was 1950.
So had they actually visited Chicago and
No,
started?
no. So that's a big part of it is that their whole, yeah, to be British before World War II and immediately after World War II was to be British. You know, it was, especially after World War II, it was hard to get out because of cash issues and just the post-war situation. But even before, you know, it's an island. It's a special place, right?
Yeah.
So the connection between British modernism and continental modernism, continental European modernism, you know, was one of distance for the most part, except for the few emigres who ended up coming there. So they did meet Mies. Mies came to London in '59 to get the RIBA gold medal, and there was a seminar at the AA or a lecture. Peter's photographs of Seagram Building and a few other things were part of what was in the kind of lecture that not that Mies gave, but that was given to introduce him. So there's a connection, but it is important that the way they learned about Mies, the way they learned about modernism, was at a distance. It was through magazines. It was through photographs. You know, like this 1946 article, you know, their first introduction to the Chicago Mies was, you know, right after the war. These buildings get published in the Architect's Journal, and then they start to get published in a few other things. You know, and Peter says something like, you know, it was gobsmacking, or, you know, I don't know what he said, like it blew us away. Basically, they saw these buildings. To them, you know, they seemed, you know, intensely radical and clear, but the way that they encountered them was through mediation. You know, which then plays into this idea that you know, their understanding of Mies was always an architecture mediates.
You know, when I think of Mies, I think of exquisite material refinement and detailing, and it's just a luxury that I cannot equate with the word verbalism in almost any way. So where did the connection come in between those two terms?
That's what I was talking about.
Still don't quite get it.
I think we have time for one last question. Yes. Any questions from the audience?
Thank you for your lecture, Mark. Got a lot of curiosity spinning in my head, but just to return to the introduction that Radha gave us earlier, I want to ask you about the thisness of the stuff that we're looking at right now.
But again,
Yes.
the basement, and
So I'm looking at the screen and there's lots of images on it. I want to zoom in because I'm not totally triangulating all the stories that might be in my head. And I know that you had other stories in your head. But could you talk a little bit about the process of reading this book? Like how did you come to this? I mean, this is kind of a mini Pinterest in some sense, but I see other stuff that really I can imagine being up in your studio walls and you're moving and pinning pictures around and putting threads between things. So could you talk a little bit about the process?
yeah, that's interesting. I mean, part of why it took me so long, well, probably the reason it took me so long to write a book is because I'm just, well, but part of it is that it was circuitous. And it very much started out as kind of pick up on the notion of literalism, that this is this, and try to find. I was going to write a book about Adick's 1950s work, this guy Walter Siegel's 1950s work, and the Smithsons 1950s work. And this was going to be this kind of proto-literalist, finding sources of literalism before the 1960s. But in the process of doing that, the more I start to be attracted to the Smithsons and started to think about this Banham article and this notion of imaging as central to the origins of the Smithsons work. And so the research project became sort of very much like what you're talking about, where it's like and all research projects are like this, especially history, picking and choosing and gathering and correlating, and then you see something and it strikes you and resonates with something else. And then at a certain point, and you're right, at a certain point, producing the arrays was as generative of the theoretical possibilities as writing. And maybe it was like either, in a certain way, they're faster than writing. And then I started to think, well, maybe they're actually clearer than writing. We privilege language and say, oh, that's where ideas are. That's where serious thought happens, right? But the more you start to treat the imagery or the individual images as things or entities, that have their own specificity, kind of identities, maybe even lives. Putting together putting together the arrays is as much the intellectual project as anything else, which is kind of where I am now, like not wanting to write anymore and wanting to take this seriously. There's something that happened with digital media where it actually became easier to think in images, right, than it is with words. I think that's where we are now. And not that it's always articulate, and sometimes they're tricky and so on. But so that's I guess what I started to see and the way the Smithsons understood it was. Because Banham's book on the Smithsons, on New Brutalism, it's called The New Brutalism Ethic or Aesthetic. He's saying it should have been an ethic, and it just became an aesthetic. But, the issue is, well, what kind of aesthetic and what's the...
How does aesthetics, actually, work, do work, in the same way that, say, writing.
Yeah. Curious if you talk to other people. This seems like a generation machine, right? My question was, it seems like this is a great generation machine. We're also talking with other people and collaging ideas together to see other aspects within the history. So fascinating how it exists in the book, and interesting that to see it on a large screen and maybe even a projector could generate a different discussion, a group kind of collective imagination and imaginaries from the work, right? And then kind of making other pathways through. So really fascinating to have it in this particular format. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, great. 100% spirit.
I know. Yeah, I know everybody wants to be, but in this question of Felicia, made me think about the word you used in the context of Eames arrangement. And so the sink in front of the glass sink is a found object. You arrange it particularly almost in a kind of collage fashion. And I also see in a way in the arrangement of these images a kind of creation of a new world or a new set of relationships, a new aesthetic. I don't know if it makes any sense, but that word arrangement, when Felicia asked the question, kind of rang something from me. Thank you.